Today I am at Sky Sports Studios to interview Soccer Saturday presenter Simon Thomas about mental well-being in sport media. Simon's openness and honesty is such a rarity, and I can't wait to talk to him about such an important topic. Simon, thank you for joining me here at Sky for this interview. I wanted to start by asking how you're doing.
How am I doing today? I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm all right. I've had a good night's sleep. I've struggled with anxiety over the last few years. Thankfully, this season it's been a lot better. So today is an anxiety-free day. Got a slightly shorter show today, 4 hours as opposed to the usual 6. So yeah, all good. And that just healthy nervousness. You need that when you're doing live telly. You just need that to give you that edge. But you don't want it to be any more than that.
Before we pick apart the intricacies of you and your job, I wanted to bring it back and just talk me through your whole journey from a mental health perspective to the current day, to where we are now.
So in as brief a format as I can muster, it's really something I didn't have a problem with mental health wise until 2017. I had a couple of bouts of depression, and that surrounded some issues that I had with my first wife Gemma when we couldn't conceive another child. We had one boy called Ethan already, wanted a second, it wouldn't happen. Cut a long story short, IVF a couple of times, and I went to quite a bad place after that, and I think that was particularly as a man, that inability to deal with disappointment and anger that everyone else seemed to be fine on that front. But it wasn't until kind of autumn 2017, so I was here at Sky, it was my first spell at Sky, and I'd gone through doing Sky Sports News for a few years to doing the Football League for about 5 years, and then I got my chance on the Premier League, and I'd done a whole season on the Premier League, which I'd loved. And then I was into my second season, so in the autumn of 2017, and just really out of nowhere, I started feeling this inexplicable anxiety. The only thing I can find to explain it, it felt like suddenly you had those feelings of what you'd have ahead of an exam, an important exam at uni or school where you've done no revision. So it's your worst nightmare. And I felt that every time I tried to work. So if I had a show in the evening or a game that day, the 24 hours beforehand became the same for a number of weeks, and that's just that kind of knotted anxiety in your stomach. You begin to overthink everything, you begin to catastrophize everything. Everything's going to be a nightmare when you go on air, you're going to ask the wrong questions, you're going to mess your lines up, all those kind of things. And it became absolutely exhausting over a number of weeks, and it just would not go away. Couldn't explain why it was happening. And then it really culminates in October 2017, where I started getting panic attacks before I would go on air ahead of a Premier League game. So I used to do the Saturday lunchtime game, and the build up to it was just horrendous. I really struggled to focus when I was doing my work for the games, doing my stats prep and writing my scripts and stuff. Just couldn't focus. And you get to the day of the game, and really you just felt like your brain was overloaded. You can't really think straight. And the build up to the game, the couple of hours before, would be a nightmare. I'd have a panic attack. Sometimes only minutes before going on air, I'd have to go out the studio and go to a loo or something and just be on my own. And then bizarrely, you'd get through the actual live show. There is that moment when you go on air. So when I go on air with Soccer Saturday today in an hour and a bit's time, when the DA, the director's assistant, says we're on air, it's fight or flight. You could run away, or you fight and you do your job. And that period was, for me, the strictest kind of definition in my life of fight or flight. You had to fight. And I would get through the time on air, and then after I came off air, I was just absolutely exhausted. And that kind of carried on for a few weeks. And in the end, Sky were actually brilliant at helping me through that period, being very understanding. And in the end, it was decided that it would be wise for me to take a bit of time out to get myself right again. And that's really where it all began. And I'd say over the last few years, it's been on and off. I've never gone back to the panic attacks again, which has been great. But I have had, particularly my first season on Soccer Saturday last season, taking over from Jeff's never going to be easy. Stelling, an absolute legend, done the show for 25 years. And then suddenly you find yourself in the hot seat. So all those things of imposter syndrome, I can't do this, I'm not good enough to do this. And yet I am doing it. And so I had a lot of problems with anxiety last season. But this season, thankfully, I've only probably had 2 or 3 Saturdays where it's just rocked up. It's like something unwanted sits on your shoulder for a little bit, and you're like, oh, it's that again. And I know how to kind of deal with it now. So that's been my story in a nutshell over the last few years.
Some people will look at the setbacks that you faced being in the role that you're in and think, how on earth has he bounced back and become more successful than you was before the setbacks. You've only continuously made yourself better as a presenter, and you've gone to achieve more, and continue to impress. How do you manage to do it?
That's a really good question. The honest answer is I don't know, but I think it's that inner strength and belief that comes with experience. So listen, you Freddie, are at the start of what you hope will be a really good career. And in 10, 15 years' time, you'll look back on where you are now and think, how did I travel to where I am now and doing what I am doing now? I built up a lot of years of live TV experience. So I had 6 years presenting a kids program on the BBC called Blue Peter, so 6 years of live TV. And then by the time I'd finished my first spell at Sky, I'd done 11 and a half years of live sport, whether it's Sky Sports News or the Football League or the Premier League. So you build up a vast amount of experience, and it's something you're able to fall back on. And it's actually really reassuring. So when I talk to you about those games where you were having those panic attacks and you go on air, fight or flight, the reason you're able to fight is because you have a huge amount of residual experience to fall back on, and that ultimately gives you a belief. And so the battle I've had over the last few years in convincing myself I was good enough to go back to it and could succeed again and could be a competent presenter again is reminding myself, look, I've done it. I've been there and done it. I've got the experience. There's always new things to learn. In this business, the moment you think you've got everything sorted, it will bite you on the backside. But I know I've got the experience. So it's kind of drawing on that and kind of infusing myself with belief that I was okay. And also kind of managing how I came back to it, because I'd been out of sport for a while after 2017. And my first opportunity back into it was Amazon Prime, who had over the last 3 years these Premier League rights. And they get a handful of games around Christmas every year. And they asked if I wanted to do it the season before I actually did it. I just didn't feel ready. Didn't feel ready to answer the question, could I still do this? The next season I was. And I remember the first game I did. It was a bizarre period anyway, because we're in COVID. There's no fans at the stadium. My first game was Crystal Palace against Newcastle United. It's a Friday night. I haven't done a live game at this point for around about 4 years. I remember thinking, this is horrendous. I feel so full of anxiety. But I had to do it to answer the question, could I still do it? And it was a bit like getting back on a bike after a nasty accident. You know, can you still ride the bike? Can you still ride it with confidence? It's probably going to be a little bit wobbly at first, and it was. But I remember getting back in the car to go home that night and thought, I can still do this. So drawing on that experience got me through that first game. And then that was the kind of, I guess, the tick in the box of you can do this after doing that game. And it was gradually building up towards where I now find myself doing Soccer Saturday of just building belief up again. And actually going, when these things like anxiety hit again, which they have and did, as I mentioned, loads last season, it's being able to remind yourself, actually, you've come through all this. And that's an amazing source of strength. So I think that's where that kind of resilience has come from, and learning to live with things like anxiety and recognizing when they happen, knowing what to do when they happen, means you can carry on doing what you love doing.
Did you feel an attachment to the identity of being the Soccer Saturday presenter? And when you step away from that, how do you go about making sure that you still have a sense of self-worth and self-confidence when such a prestigious title is then taken away from you, or you take it away from yourself?
Well, I did struggle with the whole thing of identity. So for people who don't know, on top of what happened in 2017 in terms of my mental health, my first wife Gemma died very, very suddenly from a very aggressive form of blood cancer. That all happened in that autumn, and that's ultimately why I stepped away from Sky to look after our son Ethan, who was 8 at the time. And I would still make the same decision. I mean, I was lucky enough to have the financial freedom to do it because we had life insurance in place for both of us, so that gave me the freedom to make that decision. I wouldn't do anything differently. It was the right decision at the time because of what he'd been through, and I was mentally in no place to, football didn't really matter at that stage. But I really struggled after a while with identity because I wasn't ready to go back. The question was, well, who are you? You were the guy off the telly, you were the guy who did Blue Peter, you were the guy who used to do the Premier League and the Football League for Sky. What are you doing now? What is your life now? You do a little bit of speaking and you've written a book. I know they're quite big things, but I think it's getting to that place where, for me, it's recognising that it's an amazing job what I do. Being Soccer Saturday presenter is an amazing job. Being a football presenter is an amazing job. Being a Blue Peter presenter is an amazing job. but it's not me. It's not my whole identity. It cannot be everything about me, because when those things are stripped away, which sometimes they are in life, and, when you get to retirement, it's why footballers, professional sportsmen and women struggle so much when it comes to retirement, because so much of their identity is caught up in what they do, whether they're a footballer or a cricketer or whatever they do. And I had it all stripped away, yes, through my own choice. And so that leaves you the question, well, who are you? What are you about? And I really struggle with that, because you go to social events and I didn't want to be that person who always said, well, I used to do this, but I can't say I am a sports presenter right now, because I'm not. I'm being a dad, which is the most important job in the world, but I'm not that anymore. And I found it a really tough lesson, but actually it was an important lesson, because it's made me a lot more kind of relaxed about my career, because I think we can become so fearful of what life looks like. Who am I if it all fell apart tomorrow? That actually I've already worked through that and understood that who I am as a person, who I am as a husband, who I am as a father, who I am as a friend is actually of far more lasting importance than who I am in terms of what I do.
I wanted to talk a little bit about dopamine. As somebody with ADHD, constantly chasing a dopamine high or another hit of reward, working in live news environments such as yourself, it must be super high tension, high reward environment, and then you step away from it and it's gone.
Yeah.
How do you cope with it when you're by yourself in your car after finishing presenting and those rewards suddenly aren't there?
It's such a good question, because I would say it was a bigger problem when I was on Blue Peter, because that was my first ever job in TV. And I know that your generation will struggle to understand this, because in the nicest possible way, that the broadcasting landscape and the way you guys, and I look at my son, for example, who's now 15, the way they consume the media is so different. When I was presenting on Blue Peter in the late 90s and early 2000s, our audience was measured in the millions. We would get 5 to 6 million watching 3 times a week. And so there was a real high and a buzz to doing a live show, that you knew so many people in the country were watching. And you'd come off air, and I remember my first year working on the show, it was such a big come down, because you're in Television Centre in London, this prestigious place that you'd heard about and seen so much of growing up, and suddenly you are doing your job in Television Centre, all these famous people coming in and out of Wood Lane. And you do this amazing iconic show that had been running for over 40 years. And then you'd come off air at 5:20 or whatever it was. And before I got my first car, I'd jump on the tube at White City to go back to Wimbledon, where I was living at the time. And it was such a big come down, because you went from this bubble of doing this amazing show, being watched by millions around the country, and then you just sat on the Central Line at White City, heading home and getting back, and they're your housemates. And it's all just very, very normal. So there was a real kind of disconnect between that and kind of normal life. And for a while, it was quite a weird place to be in. I think now I see what I do as kind of, this is what I do. I absolutely love it. It comes with pressures that quite a number of other jobs don't have, in that you do your job in front of people. So therefore, because you are doing your job in front of people, you invite opinion, and people make opinions about you, what they like about you, what they don't like about you. And I have to kind of separate that from my home life. It's part of what I do, it's part of who I am, but it's not everything. And there is nothing more in terms of bringing yourself back down to earth than walking back through the front door, as I will at around about 7 o'clock tonight, and probably find out that my 2 youngest, who are about to be 1 and 2.5, aren't in bed yet. You've got to go straight back into being a dad. So you go from this weird kind of energy and high of doing Soccer Saturday and all the drama that can come with it, and then an hour and a half later you're walking back through the front door and you're helping my wife to put the 2 little ones to bed. So for me, it's become less of a thing now. It's kind of, this is what I do on a Saturday afternoon. I love it, but I don't find that kind of big low anymore, because it's just like, that was a nice 6 hours. Now what's next? I was putting the kids to bed and maybe a takeaway.
I'm going to be really honest with you, Simon. On my way in today,
Yeah,
I felt as in a large sense of imposter syndrome.
yes.
And since this interview got confirmed, the natural thoughts of, it's not me that's supposed to be doing this, it's going to go wrong, I'm not ready for this, this isn't, somebody else should be doing this, was very pressing in my head, and it sent me in a bit of a spiral. And I wanted to ask you, you've been very, very public about your own experience with imposter syndrome. What's your relationship like with it, and how have you managed to cope with it?
So the first thing to say, Freddie, is you should be here today, and you're doing a tremendous job. But I totally get it. It's something that I think everybody struggles with. I'd be more surprised if someone said, you know what, I've never struggled with it. Whatever walk of life they're in, whatever job they're doing. I remember being really, is comforted the right words? Reassured. I spoke on mental health and imposter syndrome and a whole number of other subjects around it at a really big law firm in London about 2 years ago. Like one of the, I think they call them the Magic Circle law firms. I won't say which one, but it's huge. I mean, it's massive across the world. And I think it was World Mental Health Day. There's about 200 in their posh auditorium in central London. And the guy introduced me at the time, at the start, was one of the senior partners, and he thanked me at the end. And he came up at the end, and this is a guy who's got 30, 40 years of operating in one of the world's biggest law firms, at the very top of his game. Yeah, you look at it and think everything's sorted. And he says, I remember him saying, thank you for talking about imposter syndrome. It's something I still struggle with every single day. And I was like, wow. You know, this is a guy who immensely successful, brilliant at what he does. And yet he has those days, like you've just been talking about, where he arrives in central London and thinks, I shouldn't be doing this. It's so common, but it's also really hard to deal with. And I felt my first season of Soccer Saturday was like imposter syndrome on steroids, because when I was asked to apply for the job the summer before last, it was one of those moments in life where you think, well, I cannot not go for it. But look at who I'm replacing. I'm replacing Jeff Stelling. He's done it since the start of Soccer Saturday. So he and the show have grown together. He's phenomenally popular. He's absolutely sensational at what he does. And you're going to step into his shoes and sit behind that desk, albeit in a new studio. And when I got the job, that was the biggest thing I struggled with, because as much as I would tell myself and tell people, like I did in my first show, if I can be half as good as Jeff, I've done something right, I'm going to do it my way. The reality was your head's all the time say he wouldn't have done it that way. And he did it so much better. Look how quick he was. But the thing is, it's such a complicated show anyway. You're only there for 6 hours. You're covering most Saturdays, 9 leagues. We probably average around 65 games we are covering between 12 o'clock and 6 p.m. every Saturday. So it's phenomenally complicated anyway. And you add into that this feeling of being totally unworthy to be doing this job. And that's taken time. It's taken time. But what reassures me, not just coming back to what that guy said at that law company, is that when I have spoken about this, and I have spoken about it online and posted about imposter syndrome, I've had so many messages, private messages from people in the business, people who do similar jobs to me, people I would look at and go, they're so good at what they do, like they're better than me. And I think that's part of the problem of being in this industry, which feeds into imposter syndrome, is that because of its very nature, seems an obvious thing to say, it's visual. So I get to see what everyone else is doing. You know, if you become one day a sports broadcast journalist and say you ended up in front of camera, for instance, you will get to see what all your kind of competitors are doing, unless you choose to switch everything off, which if you want to be involved in sport is not a wise idea. I get to see all the other presenters at work on the other channels, and it feeds into that. I look at them and go, they're so good at what they do. Occasionally I look at one and think, I'm better than that. But more often than not, you're looking going, wow, they're really good. And that feeds the imposter syndrome kind of monster inside you. And last season, it was really fed massively. One of the most helpful things I did in terms of denying the imposter syndrome monster food was I didn't look at social media. I did, but I wouldn't go anywhere near stuff about me. I wouldn't put my name into the search engine on X and see what everybody was saying. I just stayed clear of it, because ignorance is bliss. I know there'll be people for whom they hate the fact Jeff isn't doing it anymore. They won't like the fact I'm doing it. They won't like the way I dress, the way I sound, or the way I look, or the fact I'm not as quick as Jeff was at coming up with little stats, or whatever it might be. Don't feed it. Steer clear.
I really hope that you all found my conversation with Simon as interesting and informative as I did. And if you are struggling, just remember, as Simon said, you are not alone.
My message to anyone struggling would be firstly this, and I know it will sound like a bit of a cheesy, corny catchphrase, you're not alone. That was one of the most valuable things to me when I struggled, is when I would hear from other people who'd say, I've been through exactly the same thing. There is something deeply reassuring when we hear from other people about the fact they've also struggled with this, because you are very, very rarely the only one who's going through this. The second thing I'd say is just try and open up. If you're a guy and it just feels the most uncomfortable thing in the world, being honest and open and vulnerable about how you're feeling. It's honestly a superpower. It's the best thing you can do. It might feel uncomfortable, but it opens up the way to beginning to find a way to healing from some of the things you're struggling with. And the last thing I would say is this: there's always hope. You might be in a place right now where you are struggling. You might be in a place right now where you feel identity-wise, I don't know who I am, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. The great thing is, and I've found this throughout my life, particularly the last few years when I've been to some really dark, low places, there's always a way through. But to find the way through, you've got to start walking. And if right now all the things you can do is crawl, start crawling. One day you'll walk, and one day you'll run.